Thank you to my colleague Clara, and welcome once more. My name is Ollie Henman from Action for Sustainable Development, and together with Forus, we are very pleased to welcome you to our joint webinar today. As Clara has mentioned, this is a webinar that is looking ahead to the 2023 HLPF, the Voluntary National Reviews, and the SDG Summit. As many of you know, we are reaching the midway point of the SDGs, and many of us who've been following the SDGs over many years will be planning for quite a wide range of activities in the coming year. So to help us to get planned and to think ahead jointly, we have a number of great speakers for you who will give you some insights into what's coming up and also some reflections on what happened in this past year, 2022, and what learning we can take forward to the next year. But before we do that, we'd like to share a poll with you just to gather an idea of who's in the room. And even before that, let me pass the floor to my colleague Deirdre to say a few words from the Forus side.
Thanks very much, Ollie. And hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this webinar here today, which is about preparing for the 2023 VNRs, but also for the important SDG Summit that will be taking place next year. And we're lucky to have Arelys Belorini with us today, who's going to give us an update on what the planning has been so far in terms of the SDG Summit, what to expect. So thank you for attending here today. We're delighted to have this webinar on the 1st of December because we feel it's in plenty of time to really help CSOs at the national level to actually start to engage and prepare their engagement with the VNR process in their countries. And we're getting earlier and earlier every year. So hopefully the webinar today will give you some ideas about how to move forward with engagement with the VNR process in your country. You'll hear about other CSOs and maybe what they have done in the past in terms of promoting their engagement with the VNR process. So look forward to a great discussion and to getting everybody mobilized to start engaging with their VNR process straight away. So thanks very much, and back to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Deirdre. It's great to work together on this. And as you say, starting early, ready for next year. So just to help us to understand who's on the call today, we've got an initial poll for you, which we're just going to launch. It should appear on your screens now. And you will have 4 questions. Please fill those in if you can see them on your screen. The first question is to highlight which region of the world you come from. The second question is if you can let us know if your country is presenting a VNR next year in 2023. Third question is, have you been involved in preparing a report in your country before? And then finally, have you already identified any partners in your country working on the SDGs who you might collaborate with for the coming year? So this is just to give us a sense of who's on the call, and we hope that you'll have a chance now to fill that in, and that gives us a bit of an idea. We'll leave it open for just another few seconds. So it's been open for about a minute now. Can you see my screen? So hopefully you can see, I can see the results here. It looks as if we have a good mix from different parts of the world. We have a number coming in from Sub-Saharan Africa, from Asia, one from the Middle East and North Africa, several coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Europe and North America. We can also see that many of you have been involved with reports before, but actually currently on the call, the majority of those on the call have not been involved in a report before. So that means there are quite a few of you who want to know how to get involved in civil society spotlight reporting. And there are also quite a number of you on the call who are from countries that may not be presenting, and you're not sure if they're presenting next year or not. So you'll get a chance to see the list of which countries are presenting. And then finally, from the poll, it seems that many of you do already work in partnership with others, although there are at least 10 on the call who either don't have a partner or who don't know about who else is active in their country. So some good opportunities coming out of this call also to help to build those partnerships at the national level. So we're going to end that poll now. And thank you very much for joining. I put the final results on the screen here. You can see the overall responses, and we'll stop the screen share on that. So thank you. And I hope that also helps to give our speakers an idea of who's joined us today. So as Deirdre mentioned, we have a very good panel, and that includes a number of speakers who will be sharing their insights with you now. First of all, we have Friedrich Soltau from UNDESA, and UNDESA is the body responsible for the engagement of civil society with the UN on the HLPF and on the SDG Summit. So this gives us a good opportunity to hear directly from the UN. We'll also hear from Arelys Belorini from Together 2030 on civil society expectations for the SDG Summit. Then from Nicolas, my colleague at Action for Sustainable Development, on how to develop spotlight reports and the model of the People's Scorecard. And then finally from Deirdre, who you've already heard from, on effective advocacy on the VNRs. So at this point, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I would like to welcome Friedrich Soltau, who will be speaking to us. First of all, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for making the time. I know it's a busy time for you at the UN. Perhaps you could give us an overview on where things stand looking ahead for next year. Over to you, Friedrich.
Thank you very much, Ollie, and good day, colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening. Good to be with you, and thank you for this invitation. I wrote a reminder to myself to speak slowly so the interpreters can follow. It's really great that you have this in a multilingual format, which we sometimes forget to do even at the UN, so that's great. So as Ollie said, I want to give you a brief overview of what to expect, what's coming down the line for the VNRs. I should also say that a lot of the information I'm sharing with you is available on our website. So we have the Secretary General's voluntary guidelines, and these set out sort of a voluntary framework for the VNR reports and the review. So these are available on the HLPF website. This also contains some of the information I'll be sharing, for instance, the timeline that countries would be adhering to in terms of preparing their inputs and submitting final reports. So some of the dates and times I'll mention are in that set of guidelines. We also have a synthesis report, which we prepare annually, which seeks to summarize or capture some of the main elements of the previous year's VNRs. And that's also available on the website. So giving an overview, a quick dive in, because of course, much as this, the best material, of course, is the basic source material, but we don't, it's quite overwhelming to sometimes read all those reports. But let me go then quickly to the status. Where are we now? I think what one can say is that the VNRs have been an overwhelming success in terms of subscription and enthusiasm. To date, we've had 291 voluntary national reviews presented as of the 2022 High-Level Political Forum. And as already mentioned, the HLPF, which meets annually in July, is the forum where the countries come to present their review. And next year, the HLPF will take place from 10 to 19 July, and the ministerial segment from 17 to 19, the sort of high-level part, is when the VNRs are presented. So that's sort of the timeline that countries have leading up to that. So as I said, 291 VNRs, and we have, that also means that we have out of about 189 countries that are eligible to present VNRs, we had 187. So not many more to go. It's a few small countries, islands and others that haven't yet presented a VNR, but almost universal take up of the VNRs, which speaks to the enthusiasm and the interest of the reviews. So going then a little bit to what's coming down the line. Countries are, of course, the final hurdle is the July HLPF, but along the way, On the 3rd of May, countries are asked to submit their main messages. This is sort of a headline summary of the key takeaways. This is translated into all the UN languages. So it gives a sort of top line finding of the reviews, and the final reports are due on the 9th of June. And they are posted on the website in the format. I think we have an open mic somewhere. The reports are posted in the language received on our website without editing from our side. In terms of the preparation, the Secretariat, I'm in the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And what we do, we are the Secretariat for the HRPF. So the management and organization of the HRPF falls to us. As part of that, we also provide support to the VNRs. Basically, what we do is we work with the countries, share with them the guidelines, share with them experiences, connect them with previous years' VNRs to try and bring them up to speed with good practices, and basically bring them to a point where all of them are well prepared to submit substantive VNRs at the HRPF. And to that end, next week we'll be conducting a workshop for the VNR countries in Italy, and then in April next year also a second workshop, which we usually do, and this one will be in Bulgaria. Now, these workshops are intended to be a safe space for the countries, so they're not open to outside participation, because we found that the VNRs, the countries are a little, I don't say shy, but they need a space where they can be open about their challenges and the process of the VNRs. But there are other opportunities for the countries to interact. I should mention, and at this point, the regional forums on sustainable development, all of the 5 UN sort of regions where the regional commissions have their bases. Each of those regional commissions organizes a regional forum on sustainable development, which feeds into the HRPF, and will have the first one in Africa at the end of February in Niamey, Niger. So those forums are also a key waypost for the preparations. And usually what happens is there's a discussion on perhaps some of the VNR countries have some early discussion on where they're going. There's a discussion with previous VNR countries, sort of the regional level priorities and experience sharing on the VNRs. I'm also very happy to see that there's a discussion in the next session on the SDG Summit, because this year is a special year. As Ollie mentioned, we're halfway through. And we also feel that the VNRs this year are an opportunity to capture some key policy priorities, perhaps transformative policies, examples of successes, as well as challenges which can be highlighted at the summit. So using the VNR process, the preparatory process, as a means to bring meaningful input when leaders meet here in September 2023. So a special year all around, but I think also a special opportunity for the VNRs to really capture some transformative policies. Now, I want to say a few things about perhaps the challenges and the areas of improvement for the VNRs. I think sometimes I heard the other day, a commentator say, the VNRs are a bit like a beauty pageant. That's a fairly harsh judgment, but nonetheless, there are areas where there's been a lot of improvement. If we go back to the first reports from 2016, we see that the current reports are much more substantive. Far more data as can be expected, far more detail, and also more analysis and evaluation of successes and progress. Nonetheless, on data, often we really need to see perhaps more meaningful use of data. Where data is lacking in terms of quantitative data, can we make use of qualitative examples? So the absence of indicators, we feel, is not a reason not to meaningfully use data in terms of trend series, so we can see what it means to give an example. In some reports, we give an example, we don't know. How does this relate to prior progress? Where does it relate to regional sort of indicators? So a meaningful use of data. Secondly, one of our colleagues, one of your colleagues, Mr. Saraski, has mentioned this issue of first-timism. One thing we want to see now that all the reports essentially are in the second or third reporting phase. What is the connection from report to report? How much progress has there been? Does one report make make statements about future intentions, and if so, does a second report report on how that progress has taken place or not. So linking up the reports and evaluating progress over time. I think that's a key area where we see quite a bit of progress, but certainly an area where more can be done. So these reports are really a good overview of progress and challenges over time. So that linking idea. The other area where we could see more, we could see more progress is linking the report to other reporting frameworks, whether those be in the environmental arena, whether those be under the human rights framework, trying to connect to the material and the findings of other reports. That's also an area where putting together the different reporting frameworks and allowing the VNR process to benefit also from those reporting frameworks. And there's a great number of tools, for instance, in the human rights arena. The Danish Institute for Human Rights has done a lot of work linking SDGs and the recommendations of the human rights mechanism. So there's material there which can be taken up in the VNRs. And I think with that, I'll just say again, it's a special year. We really hope that the SDG Summit will also lift the profile overall of the Sustainable Development Agenda, and also at the same time give the 41 countries that are doing the VNRs this year a real boost, and really that they can use those VNRs to highlight key policies and prepare meaningfully for the summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Friedrich. We really appreciate the time that you've spent with us and the fact that you've been able to give such a good insight into the process that the UN supports, and enabling different voices to be heard through those VNRs. It's great that you have been able to hear directly from the UN, and thank you for your time once more. You've mentioned there the link into the SDG Summit. And so our next speaker, Arelys Belorini, who's a very experienced civil society partner there based in New York, is going to give us some insights into what we can expect from the SDG Summit. So Arelys, over to you now, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Oli. Do we have the PowerPoint? Yes, next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, so the key question, what to expect? Can we go back one slide, please? Yes, what can we expect from the SDG Summit? I think this is a very critical question. First, let me share a brief overview on the purpose of the summit. The summit is actually a meeting of the high-level political forum, but it meets at head of states level. In 2023, we will actually have 2 meetings of HLPF. The one in July that Friedrich was referring to, and this HLPF takes place every year, and it includes a ministerial segment, and the summit that takes place in September under the General Assembly. So it is intended, the summit is intended to review progress on implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the achievement of the SDGs. It's also intended to provide political guidance for accelerating the full SDGs implementation. And most importantly, it adopts a declaration that is at head of states level. So that is a higher level than the HLPF in July adopts, because in July is a declaration, it's a ministerial level. This one is at head of states level. So this is the first point, or where, what can we expect? Now, what are the facts and what is the context that we have so far that we will have in 2023? First of all, this is the second summit. And as Oli was pointing out at the beginning, is a midpoint of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And we are at a time of major setbacks to progress and achievement of the SDGs across several areas. We are faced with a shifted world due to the global pandemic. We are faced with a highly polarized world due to war and conflict, and major crisis on climate and hunger. Next slide, please. So what is the road that we have traveled so far since the adoption in 2015 of the 2030 agenda that brings us to this 2023 SDG Summit, which we believe is at a critical moment. So first of all, we have had 7 years of HLPF sessions that have been tracking progress on SDGs. That is from 2016 to 2022, where reports of VNR have been presented with the purpose of tracking progress on the implementation. We had one previous summit in 2019, an SDG summit that took a stock of SDG implementation. So let us remember that at that time, a wake-up call was made by the Secretary General affirming that several SDGs were off track. We have also had thematic review of all SDGs. So far, we have 188 countries that have presented VNRs more than once. And by the end of July in 2023, we will have 333 VNR reports that have been presented at HLPF. Up until now, we have 291, as Friedrich mentioned, but by the end of July next year, we will have 333 reports. We also have annual reports from the Secretary General on SDG progress, and we will have 2 global Sustainable Development reports. These reports are developed by independent group of experts. The second report will be issued by September. Next slide, please. So, next slide. So one could say say we have done quite a bit of tracking and monitoring of progress on SDG implementation and where they are, where the SDGs are. So from our perspective, there is already a strong body of evidence on progress and lack of progress on SDGs, plus the gaps. We have substantive lessons that have been learned on what works, including what good practices, but also on what doesn't work. The question on what to expect is then quite a valid one. And from my perspective, when we come to the SDG Summit in September in 2023, the world needs solutions and resolutions. We need clear and firm commitments to address the issues, the barriers to implementation and achievement of the SDGs. For instance, and just to name a few, there is no clear way to financing the SDGs. It's a big question mark. Some groups that have been traditionally left behind are prioritized to the detriment of others that continue to be left behind. So an example of that is the rise in poverty, inequality, and regression on gender, which is one of the effects of prioritizing approaches that negatively impact other marginalized and vulnerable groups. We have civil society, we need civil society engagement and participation. This is critical, and this needs to be addressed. I mean, we are faced with a very strong shrinking of civil society space all across. Partnerships, there needs to be clear path and way forward on partnership contributions to SDG implementations. And when it comes to systemic issues, it is long overdue. It needs to be addressed, particularly on the social and the economic areas. Next slide, please. So from the perspective of the civil society, we think that it is important that we come to the summit with a forward-looking messages. Let us put forward proposals on solutions building on the national and subnational experience, including from the grassroots. Engage in influencing the SDG Summit declaration. 2 co-facilitators have been appointed by the President of the General Assembly. Those are the Ambassador of Ireland and the Ambassador of Qatar. And very soon they will be presenting a timeline on the informal negotiations or consultations that are going to be leading up to the SDG declaration. Next, I think we need to speak and promote synergy and linkages with our common agenda, which is also seeking to address some items that are related to the 2030 agenda and the SDGs, not only on issues, but also on work streams. So we need to emphasize that synergy needs to be created. We need to facilitate voices from marginalized and often left behind groups, such as children, young people, persons with disability, indigenous population, etc. It cannot be business as usual. We know where we are. In 2023, for the SDG Summit, no more tracking progress. Let us move on to solutions, commitments, and accountability. And I think from civil society, we can play a big role in driving that intent. Thank you. Back to you, Oli.
Great. Thank you so much, Arelys. Thank you for such a clear set of recommendations and such a good overview of what to expect in the coming year, both in terms of HLPF in July and then looking ahead to September for this SDG Summit, which, as Arelys said, only happens once every 4 years. And this is only the second one in the cycle since 2015. So a big moment coming up. We are, as always in these conversations, time is short. And so I'm keen that we move ahead and hear from the next two speakers. And then hopefully we still will have a chance to have a couple of questions. I see some questions coming in through the Q&A, and I believe that some of them are already being answered also by Friedrich. So we appreciate that. Next up, we have Deirdre from Forus. Deirdre, over to you, please.
Thanks, Ollie, and hello, everybody. I'm going to apologise first for not having my camera on, but I am actually in bed with a very bad flu at the moment. But Ollie and myself have prepared this webinar today, and I didn't want to miss it. So I'm going to do my presentation, and hopefully I won't be coughing and spluttering in the middle of it. Anyway, so the title of my presentation today is VNR Advocacy, because as previous speakers have said, including Friedrich and you know, Ollie and others, that the quality of VNRs has definitely improved since member states, UN member states, started presenting them at the high-level political forum in 2016. However, they have a long way to go. And so it's very important that civil society does engage in serious advocacy around the VNRs. Next slide, please, Ollie. And so I'm suggesting today that there's 4 key areas where the advocacy of civil society linked to the VNRs should focus. The first area is on the national VNR process itself, so what the process looks like and consists of and so on. The second area that the VNR advocacy of CSOs should focus on is actually on the content of the VNR report. Thirdly, there should be a specific focus for advocacy around the UN high-level political forum itself, because that's the international peer review system where the VNRs are presented and reacted to by other governments and by UN agencies. And finally, the whole area of VNR follow-up should be a focus of our advocacy efforts also. So next slide, please. Thanks. So looking at the national VNR process, what kind of advocacy can civil society do around this? Well, firstly, it is important that governments, member states, are reminded that the UN Secretary General has produced revised common reporting guidelines on the VNRs. So this is where the UN Secretary General has laid out a roadmap, if you like, that should be followed by UN member states when they're preparing a voluntary national review. So it would be, again, very timely for civil society organizations who are engaging with the VNR process to write to their governments, to the key person in the government, and to mention these revised guidelines and the expectation that civil society has that they would be followed. Now, they're not absolutely prescriptive guidelines, but they do leave a lot of discretion to governments, but at the same time, they set out what the process should involve, and particularly where consultation with different stakeholder groups is concerned. So the other thing that civil society should be advocating for around the VNR process is transparency and predictability. We know the process of preparing the VNRs is short enough. Governments usually volunteer themselves in sort of October, November of a given year, and then they're presenting their VNR the following July in New York. So that doesn't leave much time to organize public consultation consultations and other ways for civil society organizations to get involved in the preparation of the VNRs. So civil society should be insisting from the outset that there's transparency and predictability about the opportunities provided to different stakeholder groups to actually input into the process. Civil society should also advocate for a focal point for the coordination of the VNR process. That makes things so much easier when, you know, a particular department and maybe a particular individual or set of individuals within a government department have responsibility for coordinating the VNR process. So civil society is aware of who they should be communicating with and targeting with their advocacy. It's also important that civil society engages in public advocacy and awareness raising about the VNR process. Again, the VNR process can be sometimes beneath the public radar. Again, many members of the public not aware that it's happening or how important it is. So it's important that civil society does help to raise that public awareness. Another thing that some civil society organizations have been very successful in doing in different countries is to advocate to actually be able to write either a chapter of the VNR themselves or a certain section of the VNR. So that's something I know certainly in Finland and in the Netherlands, civil society was successful in that. And that's essentially where we would like to go eventually, that civil society would actually have a key input into the voluntary national reviews and not have it as it is at the moment, where many, you know, civil society organizations are advocating for change, for inputs, you know, to be reflected in the VNRs, but very often don't see much evidence that the work they've done on you know, advocating for particular changes to the VNR have had any impact at all. So another thing that we would definitely recommend, and Ollie can say a little bit more about this for CSOs who are engaging with the VNR process, is to, you know, get involved with the UN major groups and other stakeholders mechanism, and particularly the NGO major group, which is very helpful for supporting NGOs around the world, giving them advice about how to engage with the VNRs, how to learn from best practice and so on. So that's something we would definitely recommend. We also know that there are a lot of very good quality VNR resources that have been produced already. And I'd like to particularly mention those produced, of course, by my own organization, Forus, by Action for Sustainable Development, which Ollie coordinates, and also Together 2030, which Arelys has just spoken to us there. But these are, and they're not the only organizations, but there are a lot of high quality resources around the VNR process, which could be very useful to CSOs, particularly those who are getting engaged with the process for the first or even just the second time. We also would advise that considerable advocacy can be done around the UN Regional Sustainable Development Forums. Those forums are organized, as Friedrich said already, by the regional commissions of the UN, and they start this year. They'll be starting in February and they run through to about May. So it is important because there you'll get some sense. Governments do attend, the member states have representation there, other stakeholders are present, and they do give an idea of what the VNR is going to prioritize and what other governments are doing and so on, a regional perspective, if you like. So they are important for civil society to attend and to engage with. And also something we encourage CSOs to do is to lobby to be included in the national government, the delegation that the government puts together to actually attend the high-level political forum. This is an important, you know, delegation that represents the country itself at the high-level political forum, and it is increasingly normal practice now to have a civil society member as part of that national delegation. I'm going to move on now quickly to the content of the VNRs. And again, just to say there are lots of useful resources that will help civil society to become aware of what the content of the VNR should be and how to go about improving or encouraging government to improve that. So a very useful resource is this report. It's jointly produced by a number of civil society organizations, including Forus, Together 2030 and Action for Sustainable Development. It's called Progressing National SDG Implementation, and it's launched every January or February, and it looks back at the previous year's VNRs, analyzes them in terms of what was good, best practice, and also the gaps and the areas of challenge. So we would definitely recommend you looking at that, because you can learn so much and then look at your own, the VNR that your own government is producing through the lens provided by that report. We'd also encourage, in terms of the content of VNRs, that civil society organizations should be promoting and pushing for the transformative SDG principles to be reflected in the reporting of the voluntary national reviews. So we know that the transformative principles are things like leave no one behind, like the important interlinkages between the different goals, like planetary boundaries, and also policy coherence for sustainable development. So to push those and to make sure that they are included in the way the government reports on progress in its VNR. It's also important in terms of the content of the VNRs to make sure that they cover all SDGs. Some governments like to cherry pick and only pick one or two, and also that there's an acceptable balance between the extent to which the social, the SDGs that are more related to social policy, to environmental policy and to economic policy are included and covered in the VNR. It's also important that civil society advocates for credible data sources to be used to substantiate the government's claims, because very often, as a previous speaker said, the government makes very big claims about what the progress that's been achieved. So it's important that those claims are supported by reference to credible data sources, and very often civil society can propose those. The UPR process yield some very important reports, and also other reports the government produces for various UN bodies like CEDAW, the Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, and so on. Civil society can also advocate for national level indicators. It is really important to have indicators against which you can measure progress. So that's something that governments could take on, but need to be encouraged to do so. And as I mentioned already, it's important to advocate that CSOs should be allowed to develop some part of the VNR, perhaps to have a chapter of their own, or even a section within a chapter that they can write themselves. And also, and we put very strong emphasis on this, it's important for CSOs to get involved with a broad alliance of other CSOs in their own country to produce what's called a shadow or a parallel report. And these reports are increasingly improving in quality, and they are very important supplementary accounts of national progress. Governments often neglect to mention certain areas, maybe certainly make exaggerated claims in certain areas. So it's very important that civil society has an opportunity to present its own assessment of the progress that's been made, the national progress on implementing SDGs. On then to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. So again, some advocacy that civil society needs to do is around making sure that these parallel reports I've just mentioned that civil society puts together, that they gain official status. At the moment, they have no status at the High-Level Political Forum. They're not even put in any kind of formal way on the UN's website. That's something we've been pushing for in recent years, to make sure that they are at least included in the review process in some way, and that they do have more status than they have at the moment. So that's something that civil society can continue to advocate for. We also strongly encourage civil society organizations to organize side events, whether they're formal or informal side events, at the High-Level Political Forum, because it is an opportunity for civil society to carry out important advocacy, including presenting these parallel reports that they've been involved in producing. The UN High-Level Political Forum is also a useful opportunity for networking, and we'd strongly advise CSOs to make an appointment to meet the national mission to the UN, their own country's national mission to the UN, when they're in New York, or if they're in New York attending the High-Level Political Forum. They're very useful contacts to have, and also other UN agencies, so to make sure to take full advantage of the opportunities for networking at the High-Level Political Forum. We'd also encourage the VNR labs, I think they've been referred to already, are very good ideas. They're sort of more closed discussions that member states engage with around the VNR process, some of the challenges they've experienced. They're not open necessarily to the public, so they're harder to sort of, or it's easier for governments, I should say, to be more honest about maybe some of the challenges and difficulties they've experienced. So again, it is important for civil society organizations to keep pushing for those. They are important, laboratories, if you like, in which the VNR process can be discussed and hopefully improved. There's also opportunities for CSOs to, share what's happening at the High-Level Political Forum with national and international media, and that's very important through social media, blogs and podcasts. And finally, as we know ourselves from particularly the COP process, the COP26 and 27, you always see the very high-profile public campaigns, protests and public events. There's less of this around the High-Level Political Forum, but I suppose we are encouraging civil society to think more about having a presence, if not within the chambers of the UN headquarters when the High-Level Political Forum is happening, but outside, making their presence and their messaging, their advocacy messaging as visible as possible. Finally, then on to the VNR follow-up. Obviously, it's very important.
I'm going to have to ask you if you can
to to wind up. Okay, so you can see there, to hold governments to account on their VNR commitments, raise public awareness when CSOs go back home about the VNR commitments that governments have made, lobby members of parliament who have an important role in agreeing budgetary allowance for SDG implementation, use reputable sources of data. So again, civil society has to engage more with national statistical offices and others, so it can be sure it's using data sources that are credible. Also, to make sure that civil society gets to participate and pushes very hard to participate in multi-stakeholder sustainable development councils and bodies at national and local level. And finally, lobbies national or local government to get involved in SDG implementation, because they're a very important actor indeed. So thank you very much. Sorry, Ollie, for going over my time, but thank you for listening to me, and happy to take any questions afterwards. Back to you, Ollie.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. And yeah, sorry to rush you. I know there's so much to cover, and thank you for giving such a wide range of insights. And even when you, are feeling under the weather yourself, thanks again for that excellent overview. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people on the call who'll want to pick up on some of these activities, and we'll hear from some of these in reference to the various VNRs that we'll be hearing from in the second panel. So just to close out our first panel, and time is pushing on, we have my colleague Nicolas Sautejeau, who's able to talk to you about a very specific tool that you can use to help to analyze the VNRs from an independent civil society point of view. And this is what we've called the People's Scorecard. Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie, and hi, everyone. So as Ollie said, I'm going to quickly take you through some of the main features of the People's Scorecard, as well as some of the findings and results from the 2022 exercise. So next slide, please, Ollie. Thank you. So you should know that the People's Scorecard tool was developed collaboratively within the A4SD network in 2018. In order to provide a framework for measuring civil society's collective perception about the depth and scope of the SDG implementation process and its progress at the national level, but also allow for some comparative analysis between countries at the global and at the regional level when it's possible. The People's Scorecard tool actually provides an opportunity for collective structured assessment of the implementation process, allowing national civil society to use the results to inform their wider policy engagement plan and as an input into the official VNR when that's a possibility, like it was in Zimbabwe, for example, in 2021. So concretely, each year, A4SD supports around 20 national civil society coalitions from countries presenting their VNRs in the context of the HLPF reporting cycle. And the methodology is actually based on a qualitative assessment of each SDG centered around 10 key areas that together constitute an inclusive conception of the implementation process. And actually, this year we introduced specific innovation regarding this underlying methodology of the scorecard with establishment of a revamped scoring scale that actually now goes from -5 to +5. It used to go from 1 to 5. And all this in the acknowledgement that, of course, the different strands that constitute the SDG implementation process, as well as the different factors that influence or determine the nature, pace, and score of the implementation process are part of a broader trajectory that isn't necessarily linear. And so this -5 to +5 scoring scale allows respondents to actually convey when there is a perceived backsliding in the implementation process, but also when there is a perceived positive progress within the implementation process. And so these 10 key areas can be further classified into 3 broader headings or dimensions, which are policy environment, institutional capacities, and inclusiveness. And regarding the sequence for the assessment, first, a survey is distributed to a wide range of CSOs and community groups, online or in person. Then specific constituency-based consultations with the historically marginalized communities in each national context are organized in order to collect their views and demands. Then the data is processed and an aggregated draft scorecard is developed, which is then presented at a virtual or in-person workshop for validation of results. And of course, this also informs a spotlight report that civil society can develop in order to push the analysis even further of the implementation process in the national context. Next slide, please, Ollie. So this is these are the countries that actually conducted people's scorecards in 2022. As you can see, we were able to cover most regions of the world with a special focus on Africa, given that in 2022, a majority of VNR presenting countries came from Africa. So that's also reflected in the scorecard. Next slide, please, Ali. So this is the first graph that I wanted to show you that actually features the ranking of countries, as it were, based on their scorecard averages, aggregated averages. And regarding the way that you should interpret and read these results, you should know that, as I already was able to tell you, the assessment framework for the scorecard is based on 10 key areas that actually bring to the fore different elements of the implementation process with an emphasis on inclusiveness and participation, which is what also gives the scorecard its qualitative nature, if you will, since it focuses on the set of actions taken to achieve certain results and not on the specific outcomes of said actions. So the main focus of the People's Scorecard assessment is to gather the collective perception of national civil societies regarding the different process-driven elements that underpin the SDG implementation process and how these are deployed in the context of a given SDG. So when you see, for example, a country like Greece standing at -6%, and other countries like Kazakhstan, Malawi, Togo, or Uruguay registering scores in the mid to high 30s, what it actually means is that in the context of the SDG implementation process, the civil societies in Kazakhstan, Malawi, Togo, and Uruguay collectively perceived that their national implementation process has achieved a slightly better rate of progress regarding what makes the SDGs a process. So regarding policy environment, institutional capacities, and to some extent also the availability of participation spaces and participatory monitoring spaces. So regarding the list of countries, as you can see, we have Sudan, Sri Lanka, El Salvador, and Greece that actually register below 0 scores, which is equivalent to a small reduction in the implementation process. And of course, Sudan, Sri Lanka, and to some extent El Salvador are countries that are currently undergoing socioeconomic and or political upheavals at the moment. So that is in some way reflected in their scorecards. In the case of Greece, has more to do with the fact that Greek civil society perceived their national implementation process are lacking substantive participation spaces. And the fact that there is also prevalence of corruption, curtailment of media freedom, etc. So that's also reflected in their scorecard. Then we have Botswana, Gabon, Jordan, Mali, Argentina, and Cameroon that actually score a very low level of progress in their scorecards. And these are countries that tend to have a low level of progress regarding policy environments and very low or even negative level of progress regarding institutional capacities and inclusiveness dimensions. And then we have Côte d'Ivoire, Philippines, Pakistan, Ghana, Kazakhstan, Malawi, Togo, and Uruguay that actually score in the mid to high, from the 20s to the high 30s, which is actually equivalent to a low level of progress. And these are countries where the scores actually reflect a medium range level of progress regarding the policy environment, but low or very low level of progress regarding their institutional capacities and inclusiveness dimension. So as you can see, even the best score is in the high 30s, so which is Uruguay, which is still in the low level of progress range. So even though this is a ranking, it's still very relative, and it shows still not as positive a picture as what one could imagine. Next slide, please, Oli. So regarding the key trends that we can draw from the country averages, overall, the averages are lower than in previous years. And this is partly due, of course, to the change in the scoring scale, but also it reflects the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the delivery of the SDGs, but also the early effects of the war in Ukraine. The highest scores, as you just saw, are in the mid to high 30s, which still convey a low level of progress at best. Has to be said also that the results are very uneven between regions, within regions, and within countries, both regarding the achievement pathways for the different SDGs, but also regarding process-related aspects. And regarding these process-related aspects, there is an overall perception that while new policies are being put in place in a number of countries, these still are very fragmented, and significant gaps remain in terms of implementation and participatory policymaking and monitoring. Next slide, please, Oli. And regarding the key process-related trends that we can draw from this global picture, has to be said that the global picture drawn from the Scorecard result is one of fragmented policy gains, piecemeal implementation, as well as diffuse procedural gains in terms of partial governance mechanisms, which are mainly specific to the SDG assessment process, and namely the VNR process. So the transformational ethos of the Sustainable Development Goals has had primarily a discursive effect by aligning to some extent different actors' discourses around the SDGs and sustainable development, which has, of course, had to some extent translation in policy and institutional settings. But more substantial transformations regarding normative elements like overarching, broad planning, legislative and policy-based changes that can actually address the systemic social and economic patterns that Arelys was talking about in her presentation are absent for the most part. Regarding institutional elements like the establishment of institutional settings that can contribute to overcome political and societal fragmentation, as well as the delivery outcomes dimensions, are still a long way from crystallizing in a consistent manner. And of course, there are global factors that are at play, given that the world, as you know, is facing overlapping global crises, from the lingering effects of the pandemic to the war in Ukraine. But there are also, of course, structural causes which have been present since the outset of the SDGs and haven't been properly addressed by the international community, which are both, and national communities, which are both political, with the lack of society-wide consensus and the participatory institutional settings to build that consensus, but also material, like the built-in asymmetries in the global financial architecture with no real mechanism for wealth or redistribution at the global level and at the national level, the prevalence still of regressive tax system, prevalence of corruption, etc. But next year, as it has been mentioned already, it's the halfway point in the SDG implementation process since 2015. So we will aim to continue this analysis and try to widen the picture even further by hopefully being able to include even more countries and have a more complete global picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to stop the screen share for 1 second in order to respond to one or two of the points that have been raised also in the chat and in the Q&A. Thank you again to everyone who's engaging. And as always, the time is limited. We are in the process now of beginning the thinking for next year. A number of people have highlighted in the chat the importance of having different voices being heard within the process of the VNRs, and that's absolutely the intention, and that is one of the things that Nicolas has highlighted. The reason that we developed this particular tool, the People's Scorecard, was precisely to try to begin to address some of those gaps and some of those challenges around hearing diverse voices. So if you are active in any of the VNR countries, we've included the list now in the chat, you should be able to engage directly with us. I will make sure that you have our emails and our contact details by the end of this session. There will be opportunities to engage through the People's Scorecard process, which Nicolas has just described. And in particular, we provide a small amount of budget, which we're grateful for the Swiss government support, which allows us to help to support some of those civil society coalitions to bring voices together at the national level. And secondly, I wanted just to emphasize something that Deirdre mentioned. There is the major groups and other stakeholders, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's basically the official process for civil society groups to engage with the UN around the HLPF. We can also make sure to connect you with those different stakeholder groups, depending on your area, your particular interest. As Deirdre said, the NGO major group is a particularly active one. There are also particular stakeholder groups, for example, for Indigenous people, persons with disabilities. There's a women's major group, there's a children and youth major group. So depending on your area and your particular expertise, we can also plug you in to those different major groups. So there will be information provided, and there'll also be a survey going out from all the major groups and other stakeholders for those who are active in the VNR countries for next year. Finally, before I pass on to the next panel, I'm also now putting in the chat the link to the regional forums, because various people were asking about the regional forums that Deirdre mentioned. So if you are keen to engage with your region, there will be a series of regional forums coming up in March and into April, and so you can also engage through those. So now to give us a bit more detail on how this works at the national level, we have a great lineup of different speakers from different countries who will talk us through some of the VNRs from this year, 2022. And for that, I'd like to pass over the moderation to Bibi from Forus. Over to you, Bibi.
Thank you, Ali. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Buenas todos y todas. And yeah, here we are for the second panel. As Ali said, we will hear from a wide range of organizations who are a bit everywhere in the world about their own experience and all the lessons that they have learned in their VNR process, and also something very interesting about how they develop independent reports from 2022. So we can start with the first speaker, who is Sime Kinala from Malawi. Kongoma is the name of the organization. The floor is yours. Thank you so much. Sime Kinala, I think you have to unmute yourself, if possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity that I can present to you some of the findings from our part and what our plans are in terms of engaging various stakeholders. So very briefly, I will talk about our coalition structure, and then I'll talk about the process of engaging the government. But prior to that, let me indicate that Malawi has done 2 VNRs in 2020 and 2022. But in terms of us doing reporting a civil study, we've done 3 reports, benefiting from what Nicolas just presented, the scorecard. So with that, we've done 3 reports, 2020, 2021, and 2022. Next slide. Yeah, so in terms of what we do, who we are a composition of 1,350 NGOs operating in different sectors of development. So you may realize that this is a very big group, but how do we engage? So to ensure that we are not leaving anyone behind, we have constituted what we call a task force on SDGs. And this basically comprises NGOs, particularly thematic or sector networks. So this one is a very important network in view that we have expertise in the different sectors of development. And to that, as I indicated, at the very pinnacle, we have what we call a task force, and then we have the NGO sector networks. So you can actually see that the task force on SDGs benefits from the professional expertise that we can get from the 20 sector networks. So from there, we also go down to the districts. That's where most of the programs are implemented. So at that level, we have institutions that are implementing programs in different sectors. Others, for example, in human rights, others governance, others providing direct service delivery to the people of Malawi. So from there, at the very bottom of the general membership, so make sure that whatever they do, they have to report. It could be through the districts and the sector networks. The whole idea is to make sure that whatever we are advancing as a coalition, it's coming from the people, not just the coalition itself, but coming from the people on the ground. Next slide. So in terms of the process of engaging with the government, as I just indicated earlier, we have interventions at the local level and at the district level. So at the district level, for example, the district networks which I mentioned, we have the CBOs, the community groups, and the various organized groups. So interacting with at the district level, we have the district level structures. For example, the local councils, the area development committees, which are largely constituted by citizens. We also have constituency committees and ward committees. Some of these are political, but we make sure that we are also able to get information from all these groups at that level. So at the national level, we have the sector networks. We also have forums for local and international NGOs, and also have regional structures, issue-based campaigners, and all those groups, including the media. So at the national level, from the government side, we do have the government ministries, the departments, the agencies. And now that we have the Malawi 2063 agenda, we have peer and coordination groups. So make sure that the CSOs at the national level are able to participate in this peer and enable coordination groups, just to make sure that the government is well informed of what citizens are talking about. So the same applies to the local level structures. We are also able to engage government so that as the councils are planning for development, which are critical in the implementation of SDGs, they're also benefiting from what the citizens are indicating. Next slide. Yeah, so in terms of follow-up, the critical question that comes is what next? After you have done all this, you have produced the reports, so what next? So as a coalition, we do convene quarterly meetings, coordinate policy demands. Every time we are having issues that are coming out from the different NGOs. So we have to streamline all these policy demands and make sure that we are able to move together. And after that, we have to align those policy demands to the recommendations according to the sectors. So the sectors are able to refine them as our professional hubs in terms of how best we can engage. And once that is done, then we make use of the strands that I've just mentioned in the previous slide. And also make sure that the sector participation in peer and enable coordination groups, before they go there, they have to engage their members. So some of these have a minimum of about 100 NGOs, and they get information from there before participating in the national level frameworks. And then also have to ensure that CISO are participating in national processes on the review of development policies. For example, next year, it will be a midpoint, as you might be aware. So we have to make sure that CSOs are participating, and the process is already starting at the national level in preparation for that. We also have other opportunities, for example, the National Development Conference, which is led by the National Planning Commission, and our duty is to make sure that as they plan, we are also there, and we're able to indicate the concerns from civil society organizations and the best practices which government can advance as we move forward. And then the fifth one is community empowerment initiatives, just to make sure that the citizens are aware of what is happening at the national level. So the CSOs in their routine programs, they have to make sure they're able to advance programs that provide capacity to the citizens so that they're able to demand accountability from the various leaders they engage. And finally, the quarterly engagement with the National Planning Commission. Maybe we might be wondering why National Planning Commission is doing emphasize. It's an institution that has been entrusted by the government to run the affairs of development at national level. So it's very critical to us, it's very critical to everyone, and we have to make sure that on a quarterly basis we're able to update each other on what they can expect from us and what we are expecting from them. Thank you so much. In brief, that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simekinala. It was very interesting, especially the part about the next steps. And now we can go to the next speaker who is here with us, which is Mbaye from Kongat, Sénégal. So, merci Mbaye, vous pouvez passer avec votre présentation. Je vous rappelle que vous avez 5 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, merci Bibi. Je vais partager l'expérience donc de la participation de la société civile du Sénégal à la revue nationale volontaire. Il faut reconnaître que le Sénégal, en 2018, a présenté un rapport national volontaire et la société civile a eu à mener un rapport parallèle donc lors de la revue nationale de 2018. Actuellement, nous sommes à la deuxième revue nationale, donc 2022, et nous avons coordonné la participation de la société civile. Donc, je vais peut-être vous présenter le groupe de travail de la société civile sur le suivi des RED qui a été mis en place en 2017 après le processus d'élaboration de l'agenda 2030. Et le groupe a pour mandat de renforcer le processus de participation citoyenne et de suivi des politiques publiques en vue d'atteindre les RED en 2030 au Sénégal à travers le dialogue avec les décideurs publics et les différents acteurs sociaux. Le groupe est composé d'organisations faîtières de la société civile. Donc, il y a des organisations de jeunes, de femmes, de personnes handicapées, d'ONG, de producteurs ruraux et de travailleurs du secteur informel, et ainsi de suite. Et les activités du groupe, que le groupe a eu à mener durant donc, ces dernières années, on a fait beaucoup d'activités de renforcement des capacités pour permettre aux groupes vulnérables, les jeunes, les femmes, les personnes handicapées, les producteurs ruraux, de s'approprier les RED et de pouvoir assurer la mise en œuvre des RED au niveau national. Nous avons aussi participé à des revues sectorielles annuelles donc des politiques, parce que pour nous, la meilleure manière d'influer la mise en œuvre des RED, c'est de participer aux revues annuelles des politiques publiques, donc le développement, parce que la stratégie de politique de notre pays s'appuie sur ces revues nationales. Et nous avons mené beaucoup d'activités dans ce domaine. Et on développe même parfois des notes de position pour partager un peu ce que nous faisons et nos positions aussi par rapport à ces revues. Nous avons aussi amené l'État du Sénégal à s'engager à la charte des données inclusives à la suite d'un long plaidoyer. Aujourd'hui, l'État s'est engagé à désagréger les données des RED à tous les niveaux de développement. Nous avons aussi appuyé l'État du Sénégal à mettre en place une stratégie nationale de laisser personne en rade. Et aujourd'hui, la stratégie est en phase de finalisation. Et il y a même un atelier de validation qui est prévu le 15 décembre 2022. Nous avons aussi produit chaque année des rapports annuels pour effectivement assurer le suivi des RED. Donc, de manière globale, voilà un peu les activités que nous avons menées, mais notre travail ne se limite pas aux revues nationales volontaires. Nous avons beaucoup de travail à faire durant toute l'année en termes de dialogue, en termes de suivi citoyen, en termes de contrôle des politiques et des programmes de développement. Donc, tout ça, nous le faisons en dehors des revues nationales volontaires.
Merci beaucoup, Mbaye.
Non, il faut avancer.
Ah, ok.
Je vais peut-être partager le processus de production des rapports alternatifs, la démarche qu'on a menée pour produire un rapport alternatif en 2022. Nous avons mis en place un comité de pilotage du processus qui est composé de tous les représentants d'acteurs, les personnes handicapées, les jeunes, les femmes, les producteurs agricoles, les ONG, et ainsi de suite. Ensuite, nous avons participé à l'enquête sur indépendant développé par 4 SDG. Je pense que c'est un instrument important parce que l'instrument nous a permis donc de diagnostiquer un peu l'environnement de mise en œuvre des ODD au niveau du Sénégal. Après, ensuite, nous avons mené des concertations décentralisées dans toutes les OSC des régions du Sénégal. Il y a la société civile, il y a les cultures territoriales, les structures privées locales, donc les médias. Et nous avons regroupé tous ces acteurs-là dans les régions à travers des ateliers donc de concertation pour prendre leur point de vue un peu sur la mise en œuvre des ODD et les préoccupations des communautés de base. Et quand nous avons terminé, nous avons élaboré un rapport national donc alternatif. Et ce rapport-là a été fait l'objet d'un atelier national de partage avec plusieurs acteurs. Il y avait les OSC, il y avait l'État, il y avait les cultures territoriales, les médias, et ainsi de suite. Et nous avons aussi remis officiellement le rapport à la structure chargée de coordonner la revue. Parce que pour nous, le rapport alternatif de la société civile doit intégrer, nos préoccupations doivent être prises en charge donc, dans le rapport national. Et je pense que la plupart de nos préoccupations ont été prises en charge à la suite de la remise du rapport donc à l'État. Donc la plupart, en tout cas, de nos préoccupations dans le rapport de la société civile a été prise en charge dans le rapport national. Nous avons aussi participé au forum de haut niveau, donc qui s'est tenu à New York. Mais ce qui est aussi intéressant et important, c'est le partage et le suivi des recommandations du forum de haut niveau. Chaque année, on organise et nos pays participent au forum de haut niveau, mais malheureusement, il n'y a pas de suivi. Et je pense qu'il serait bien que la société civile arrive à suivre les résultats et les recommandations issues du forum de New York. Sinon, les revues nationales volontaires ne servent absolument à rien. Flash, on continue.
Ah oui, excusez-moi, Mbaye, mais malheureusement, il faudra qu'on passe au prochain orateur. Mais peut-être, je vous donne la possibilité aussi aux autres d'émettre des questions pour vous dans les chats. Et tout le monde va avoir accès aussi à vos slides. Mais c'était vraiment intéressant et surtout vos recommandations.
Je voudrais revenir un peu sur les perspectives, hein, parce que pour les perspectives, on a identifié, je pense dans le dernier slide, on a identifié
1 minute,
donc,
hein, comme ça, juste, oui, voilà, ok, 20 secondes, comme ça, après, on pourra continuer avec les prochains orateurs. Désolé qu'on n'a pas beaucoup de temps.
Donc, en perspective, donc, on a identifié donc, vraiment, durant le processus, beaucoup de défis et d'enjeux. Le premier défi aujourd'hui, c'est la synergie qu'il faut créer entre la société civile et le cadre de suivi d'harmonisation des politiques. Hein? Ça, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, au niveau du Sénégal, nous avons un cadre harmonisé de suivi des ODD. Il serait bien, en tout cas, qu'on développe la synergie pour mieux impliquer la société civile et les collectivités territoriales. Il y a le renforcement de la présence et des attributions de collectivités territoriales. Ça aussi, c'est quelque chose aussi que nous avons eu à souligner parce que durant le processus, on a eu à identifier un aspect important, c'est la localisation des ODD. Aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup de faiblesses pour la localisation donc, des ODD au niveau pratiquement donc, local. Et ça aussi, c'est une faiblesse que nous avons enregistrée. Et il serait bien que les collectivités territoriales donc, soient mieux prises dans les mécanismes de suivi des ODD au niveau central. Il y a aussi l'amélioration de la participation des OC à toutes les étapes de plus et de mise en œuvre et de suivi des ODD. Ça aussi, c'est un truc que nous avons noté. Il y a aussi le déficit de prise en compte de toutes les cibles à cause des disparités géographiques et humaines. Ça aussi, quelque chose que nous avons noté. Et l'autre aspect aussi important qu'on a eu à noter, c'est la faible socialisation des ODD. Aujourd'hui, les ODD, on est en train d'avancer, on est presque à la 7e année, mais malheureusement, dans notre pays, il y a une faiblesse dans l'appropriation des ODD au niveau de la base. Voilà, merci.
Merci à vous et désolé de devoir vous couper, mais c'est super intéressant. And now next, I'm super happy to see you actually, Ines, and from La Paz in Latvia. So please share your experience with all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And actually, previous presentations were already very detailed, so maybe just very few accents from our experience in Latvia. So actually, it all started in 2018 when we had our first VNR, and that was quite a challenging process, to be honest, because what we faced was very low overall awareness of SDGs in Latvian society, in NGO sector. Actually, we didn't have a seat at the table, and we needed to use some political support to get at that table. And at the same time, after this quite hard try to understand how actually this international work is structured and how we can get involved and how can we even get a voice in NGO sector, if I may say, because there's also, you know, some kind of game played at the global level. So we actually gained a lot, and we established our national multi-stakeholder coalition as a post-VNR process. And you can also read this journey in this publication that we have. Next slide, please. So therefore, I must say that in my opinion, VNR is just a part of very long process what has happened before. And learning from this experience in 2018, we already knew that we will have a report again. And what we did, we continued to work with different stakeholders. Even in COVID, we had workshops, for example, on how we can learn from this experience in terms of sustainability. Also, every year we were making awareness campaigns, and you can see one of them, which in Latvian says targeting development. And also we specifically invested in engagement of rural areas, and we build partnerships. We have several hundreds of different type of partners in regions with whom we implemented these annual campaigns and activities. And to be honest, what we lacked, and of course, as we are dependent a bit on what type of projects we have and what type of resources we can get. We really lacked thematic different policy papers and evaluations, but we could use actually in the next VNR. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. About the partnership specifically, I already mentioned that we were making this our national coalition. But at the same time, I must say that it's a very wide scale what you can develop if you actually try. Because what we see is that government really depends in a way on the context, but is interested to cooperate because now everybody is evaluating how they cooperate with civil society and asking for that, as you heard already in this first presentation. Private sector has raising interest. They can be also quite good allies, especially the ones who are already investing in different kind of reporting methods, other NGOs. But at the same time, we must keep in mind that they have lack of time and they have quite high competition. And also, of course, academia, young people who live in this climate focus, so they are open to cooperate, local communities, and also, of course, mass media. But mass media is still quite tricky because they are looking for action more than this type of longer type of cooperations. So you can see two pictures from 2018 and 2022, where I was reporting together with our government in New York. In 2018, we were seated in podium together with governments. Now we were appearing somewhere in how to say, in some kind of little place at the podium, but still we still had a voice, and of course it's a good sign. So next slide. So I think that VNR is a really good opportunity for a voice. What we faced actually was that barbaric invasion of Russia really influenced, in Ukraine, influenced our possibilities to develop our VNR because our NGOs were active in humanitarian aid. And actually we focused therefore the topic on social resilience and tried not just to evaluate SDGs, but overall context and influences since 2018. So next slide. Oh, I don't have one. So I wanted just to say about this follow-up from this 2020 also additionally. So first, we are using this VNR again at national level because we had parliamentary election and we are still distributing this VNR. And as we had this European Year for Youth, we have specific part of young people's engagement. And we are working on showcasing this approach. Then we are invited finally in governments, specific discussions on development of government council of this thing. So I'm very happy that after hard 8 years of work, we have this place at the table. What I said, we hardly had it, even in 2018. And this year we plan to start actually drafting the next report, and based on this scorecard that Nicolas was presenting, and also we are making additional document how NGO sector impacts the SDGs and how they contribute to the social change. So actually we are really building on VNR processes at national level. So I would inspire you also to look from wider perspective when you do your VNR, how you can use it later and how you can make great partnerships and follow-up processes. Thank you. Very short.
That was great, Ines, and very interesting as always. And now next, we have Marcelo from Anong, the platform in Uruguay. As we don't have a lot of time left, I would like to encourage you and Zia to be, very fast. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Bueno, buenos días a todos y a todas. Desde Uruguay, desde la Asociación Nacional de ONGs, es un gusto y agradecemos a Forum y a A4 por este espacio. Y tratando de ser breve y de no decir, agregar otras líneas de lo que han planteado los colegas en las presentaciones anteriores, desde la Asociación Nacional de ONGs, desde Uruguay, nos parece que esta invitación a un informe de medio camino, más allá del informe de país que el año pasado realizamos como plataforma, estamos invitados a mirar estos 7 años que pasaron de los ODS y de alguna forma preguntarnos como país, pero sobre todo como región, aquellas novedades que nos aportaban los ODS, cuánto están encaminadas o cuánto vuelven a no quedar claras. Y debemos recordar que las novedades que nos traían los ODS nos hablaban de universalidad de los derechos, nos hablaba de un abordaje multidimensional de la pobreza, nos hablaba de una agricultura sostenible, nos hablaba de la responsabilidad tanto de los países en desarrollo como de los países desarrollados o de los países ricos en los procesos de desarrollo, nos hablaba también de la reducción de las desigualdades, y nos hablaba también de la institucionalidad, la justicia. Entonces, hay 7 u 8 componentes que los ODS colocaron en la agenda, que además los colocamos la propia sociedad civil a nivel, como aporte también a nivel global, que entendemos que en un informe de medio tiempo, de mitad camino, deberíamos robustecer una lectura país sin duda, pero también una lectura de sociedad civil, de cuánto hemos podido realmente avanzar en esos procesos de novedad que le pedimos y le aportamos a los ODS. Por ahí es fundamental el aporte de Forum y el aporte de A4 en estas herramientas que, como decía Nicolás, se están poniendo en juego para colaborar en los informes voluntario país, pero cómo pensar en alguna herramienta que coloque alguna mirada un poco más global, como también lo decía Nicolás, y más allá de que los países no tengamos que presentar nuestro informe voluntario el año que viene, sí podamos avanzar a informes por regiones, a informes país que acumulen y que nutran la discusión del proceso hecho hasta ahora de sociedad civil en relación a los ODS. Desde Uruguay, en realidad, ahí poníamos en la placa, buscamos generar, con el reciente informe y con los informes ya presentados, colocarlos en términos de diálogos regionales. Si bien son informes países, las regiones son importantes poder dialogar sociedad civil y pensarla en conjunto. Las organizaciones nacionales los gobiernos nacionales y departamentales, como también decían los colegas, y obviamente los actores de la cooperación, que son parte necesarias para provocar estos posibles encuentros, para hablar de los informes ya presentados y a medida de síntesis, para poder colocar sobre la mesa qué procesos nos hemos dado y cómo esos procesos han sido priorizados o no por los distintos actores estatales o de cooperación, qué actores fueron involucrados, cuánto el sector empresarial también pudimos involucrar en estos procesos, y qué recursos realmente tanto a nivel país como la cooperación fueron colocados en las distintas regiones del país para que esto sucediera. Y bueno, creemos y apelamos a que, bueno, recién nos compartían el calendario del cronograma de trabajo que se proyecta para este año, y ahí decíamos, bueno, cómo alternar entre las distintas herramientas que disponemos de distintas prácticas, tanto a nivel digital, como espacios presenciales, como consultas ciudadanas. Creemos que estos diálogos deben contemplar las tres dimensiones. Y un poco las etapas, la próxima diapo, por favor, las etapas que estamos manejando para poder llegar a este proceso es definir una ruta con los distintos actores que puedan generar acuerdos de trabajo, poder elaborar síntesis de estos 7 años que pasaron en la región y a nivel nacional, y que esos sean insumos de diálogo a nivel de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil regional y a nivel de las organizaciones obviamente locales. Por lo cual, desde ANOM agradecemos la invitación y convocamos a las distintas plataformas de sociedad civil a encontrar en este informe de medio camino la posibilidad de también volver a hacer una síntesis colectiva de aquella novedad que buscamos y que aportamos a los ODS de sociedad civil. Estamos pudiendo avanzar o estamos en retroceso, particularmente en una región de América que lamentablemente el efecto de la pandemia nos retrocede 20 años atrás, y de alguna forma eso nos alerta a decir todos los avances alcanzados en realidad rápidamente se vieron vulnerados por una pandemia que golpeó y aumentó la desigualdad en nuestra región, por lo cual claramente debemos como repensar qué hemos podido avanzar estructuralmente y cuánto hoy por hoy nos queda de camino en esta agenda de los ODS. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo. Muchas gracias. And now, as our last speaker to wrap up this panel, already we apologize to the interpreters because we are running a little bit late, but we have Zia from PDA in Pakistan. Zia, the floor is yours. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bibi. Pakistan actually presented its first VNR in 2018. Sorry, 2019. And at that time, the Pakistan government did not have that much of, understanding perhaps about the VNR process. So they invited Pakistan Development Alliance, that is one of the largest coalition that works on SDG sensitization and engaging with related stakeholders. So we were invited to intervene into district level governments. So we went into 42 districts across the country out of 120 districts in Pakistan, and on the multi-poverty index of the UNDP with the collaboration with the government. So the quite inclusive. The labor organizations, the civil society organizations, and we come up with the 450 pages report. The government actually did not even, I think that they even did not read that, and they come up with their own report. That was shock for us, though they recognized that we facilitated them a lot, but there were several suggestions and recommendations on behalf of the civil society in that report, and we followed it up. Say, for example, by 2019, we had national data available against global indicators of SDGs against only 50 indicators. So we mobilized post-2019 HLPF, we mobilized the civil society organizations and pushed the government, and we witnessed that by 2022, we had data against 96 in
Hello, Gia. I think we might have lost you. Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's only for me, but it froze all of a sudden. Ollie, can you also confirm? Yeah.
Yes, I think we've lost Zia, unfortunately.
Okay. Maybe he can share some of his comments later on by email or in another format. And I would suggest, if it's okay with you, Ollie, and if it's okay with everyone, that you take back the floor, take back the mic for your final comments and the follow-up. Thank you.
But before I do that, Bibi, thank you so much to you and thank you to that whole panel. I think we've had some really strong examples of different VNR experiences, and hopefully that's given some ideas to those of you who are joining us on how you might also engage. Bibi, did you also want to just share the feedback survey that we have, just so that people are aware of that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ali, for the opportunity. So you can see here on the screen, you have a QR code. Feel free to scan it if you have a mobile phone and to answer this 20 seconds survey. This will allow us, as well as the A4SD, to improve future webinars and to know what we need to change, what we need to focus on more. And I'm also going to put the links in English, French, and Spanish in the chat. So thank you so much, Ollie, and yeah.
Thank you, Bibi. So we are coming to the end, and I'm very sorry that we've had less time for questions than we would have liked. We had such a strong panel with such a diverse mix of speakers. It's meant that the time has really run out now, and I'm afraid, as Bibi has mentioned, we have a limited amount of time with our interpreters, so we won't be able to run on any longer. But I did want to just take a minute to reflect on everything that you've heard today. You've heard about what's coming up for 2023, the process towards the regional forums in March. And if you're interested in getting involved with those, we've put the link in the chat and we'll make sure to promote that to you afterwards. Then the build up to the HLPF in July, and there will be national level dialogues happening in each of the countries. Again, we've highlighted in the chat the list of those countries that will be under review in the VNR. So the period from January to July is really your opportunity in your countries to reach out, find out who's active with the coalitions, find out ways to bring together joint ideas ready for those VNRs. And from our side, we will be providing support both in terms of the scorecard that Nicolas has mentioned, and using that methodology as a way to gather views from across civil society and make sure that we have those independent views that can be presented at the HLPF, and also through the major groups and other stakeholders, which we mentioned. There will be a survey going out, which anyone can fill in. You don't have to be officially a member of the major groups at this point. Anyone who's interested in engaging can fill in that survey and show that you're interested in a VNR country, that you work in that country, and you'd like to contribute to a joint statement on behalf of those different constituencies to be read at the HLPF next July in New York. And then finally, September, there will be this 2023 summit, and many of you, we hope, will work with us to raise awareness, potentially to do some public events in your countries around September and the SDG Summit. So thank you again to all of our excellent speakers. And thank you to all of you for staying with us for this time. And once again, on behalf of Forus and our own organization, Action for Sustainable Development, it's been a real pleasure to have so many of you with us today. And we look forward to the conversations as we begin the new year in 2023 and kick off the process towards those VNRs next year. Thank you again and take care. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you
Take care.
to the amazing interpreters as well.